Okay, so then let's start. So can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So I am the Director of Research and Advocacy for the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center. I
Mm.
oversee all of our original research and all of our federal and state and local advocacy efforts. So at the federal level, we focus mainly on repealing SESTA FOSTA, which was a law that was introduced in 2018, which creates a carve out for Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act,
Mhm,
which basically is like the protection for freedom of expression on the internet. And
mhm,
SESTA FOSTA made it so internet platforms are liable for content shared by users in anything that may facilitate sex work or trafficking into the sex trades. I'm happy to speak about that piece of legislation a little bit more, but just in general, it's kind of a good example of the federal advocacy efforts that I am part of. And then at the state and local level, we have an associate director of government affairs who I manage. We really take guidance from local groups. So we don't lead efforts at the local level as much, but we really just provide support to local sex worker rights groups that are doing advocacy for policies that are protective of the rights of sex workers and people in the sex trades. And then we do original research. So right now, we have a project with the Global Health Justice Partnership with Yale University. So it's a consortium of folks who are getting degrees in law and also in public health. And we're doing research around district attorney policies on non-prosecution of sex work related charges, and then also forms of accountability for police who commit acts of violence against sex workers. So I do a lot more than just that, but that's kind of an encapsulation of the work that I do with the Sex Workers Project. Me personally, I have been in the role for a bit over a year, started in August 2020. I previously worked significantly in anti-trafficking, but really doing it in a way that was about the human rights of the people who were going to be impacted by policies around anti-trafficking. So that includes sex workers and people migrating for work. Uh, I had worked with the State Department, coordinating their human trafficking expert consultant network. I have been a case manager working with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, doing family reunification for kids who come across the US southern border with Mexico.
mhm.
Um, and then I worked for many years in Southeast Asia, mostly in Thailand, both getting my master's degree in human rights and also as a consultant with several different human rights organizations and intergovernmental organizations, including the International Organization for Migration, working on policy and program development focused on the impacts of labor migration and also asylum procedures, and did direct service work in Greece, working with people seeking international protection, mostly folks from Syria and Afghanistan.
Amazing. Oh my gosh, so much stuff.
Yeah.
Like, that's all amazing. So you started with like working kind of with sex trafficking, and then it kind of migrated over to more like rights of sex workers.
Yeah, so I in college learned about human trafficking. I would say that as an organization and me individually, I tend to not use the term sex trafficking. We focus on human trafficking broadly and then are specific about the labor industries in which people are being trafficked.
Mhm.
We see that sex work is work. So distinguishing between sex trafficking and labor trafficking is false in our view. Really, it's about human trafficking and figuring out ways to ensure that people aren't being exploited in any industry, including the sex trades. But yeah, so my background was first focused on anti-trafficking efforts in different labor industries, and through that saw that a lot of anti-trafficking efforts were really harmful towards sex workers.
Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so being in Southeast Asia, I saw the impacts of a lot of international organizations who came with the viewpoint that anyone doing sex work was being exploited, and that the way to address exploitation in the sex trades was to rid the country of the industry itself instead of trying to improve labor practices within the industry. So a good kind of example of that is like, we know that there is trafficking and exploitation that goes on in the fishing industry in Thailand, but there aren't efforts to actually shut down the fishing industry entirely. There's ways to address the exploitation that's happening in a way that also maintains the industry itself. Whereas on the other side, we saw that instead of trying to fix the issues that we see within the sex trades, there were a lot of groups that were trying to just end the sex trades entirely. It's really not an effective strategy. And what I saw happening wasn't that like the sex trades were actually going away. They were just becoming more dangerous and more precarious because they were less visible. So there were fewer ways for people involved in the sex trades to seek assistance because there were all of these efforts to make the industry more regularly or more criminalized, more highly criminalized. So it pushed the industry underground.
And do you think all of that has to do with like the stigmatization of like sex work?
Yeah, I think a huge portion of that has to do with stigma associated with sex work and also just stigma associated with sex and sexuality generally. A fear of having open and honest conversations about sex and just a discomfort that there are people who are making a financial living off of being involved in the sex trade. So instead of really interrogating those areas of personal discomfort, there's these strong efforts to just end the sex trades entirely. I would say it's kind of similar to the conversations we're having right now in this country around abortion and reproductive health care, where there's a few people who, I mean, not a few, you know, many people who personally see abortion as immoral and because of their stance on abortion are trying to regulate and legislate who can get one.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar with sex work where there's people who personally have a discomfort with it, who see it as immoral. And because of that, they want to limit who can do it and ultimately try to end the sex trades entirely. And it's about their own personal feelings about it versus what is in the best interest of the people involved. So just as, you know, there's these legislative efforts to end abortion, there's legislative efforts to end the sex trades. And ultimately what happens is that people are still going to get abortions. It's just going to be more dangerous. It's going to be more costly. It's going to really limit the ability of Black, Brown, LGBTQ, any marginalized community, people who are experiencing poverty, people who are low income, they're going to have a harder time getting an abortion and they're going to be negatively impacted. And we see the same thing happening with legislation that is harshly restricting the sex trades, is that the people who are most harmed are also the same people who are most harmed by other legislation that is so highly restrictive in reproductive health. It's people who are Black, trans, gender non-conforming. These are the folks who are disproportionately harmed by criminalization.
And do you see this change of like trying to like get rid of the sex trade or sex work in general in the US? Is that happening in the US right now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There, Sesta Fosta is a good example of that, where it's a piece of federal legislation that both regulates sex work and trafficking in the sex trades. And in the way that the language is presented in the law itself, conflates sex work and trafficking. It makes an assumption that all work that's happening in sex trades is exploitative. And that is a direct effort to end the sex trades entirely. Also, so that is a piece of federal legislation. So that is a law that people in all states have to abide by. But sex work itself is not federally criminalized. It happens on a state by state basis. So there's no law precluding people from doing sex work, but in every state, there are laws that say that it is a criminal act to engage in sex work as a worker, as a client, as a manager, except for in Nevada, where it is regulated and legalized in a very limited number of counties. It's not legal or regulated in Las Vegas. It's not regulated or legal in Reno. It is only in a small number of counties, and it is not a model by which we would see people being able to engage freely and actively in the sex trades. It's actually like created different forms of discrimination, that kind of policy. So we are directly in support of decriminalization, which is distinct and different from legalization. So decriminalization removes the barriers
Mhm.
from doing sex work. It makes it so that people aren't in danger of being arrested constantly, but it doesn't create such strict government regulation of the industry to make it almost impossible for people to freely engage in the work.
Work. Got it. And so your whole organization pretty much just focuses on the destigmatization of sex work.
Yeah, so we just launched a film, a documentary. It's part of a series that we're trying to develop. We're seeking funding right now to develop future series in this. And it's a wonderful, incredible snippet of the reality of doing sex work. So it is 20 minutes long and it follows the experiences of several people involved in the sex trades, both people who are workers and people who are clients, and really starts to look at the healing nature of doing sex work. So it's called Sexual Healing, and it focuses so heavily on just the diversity of people involved in this work. So it's a really critical piece to destigmatizing and just creating a reality of what it is to do sex work and the diversity of people who are involved in it. So instead of it being this assumption that it's all cis women being victimized in this industry, this film is about showing the reality that it is a very diverse industry of people from all different backgrounds. And it is not just exploitative. There is great joy that some people experience doing this work.
And I think that's amazing because even I'm guilty of it myself. I always, just because I've interviewed so many like organizations that not necessarily talk down on sex work, but they always see the bad side of it. And that's why I thought your organization is so fascinating, because I've never seen the other side of it. And that's why I want to interview you so bad, because I think it's important for people to know both sides. And that's
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
it does. But for your organization, do you guys work directly with sex workers?
I mean, we work directly with them, and we also are a staff made up of people with lived experience as sex workers. So we have in our management, at least half of staff have experience doing sex work. We rely heavily on the expertise of staff who have that experience. We also partner with several organizations that are sex worker led. We really emphasize working with people who have done sex work in the past or have also experienced trafficking in the sex trades. We don't want to present a false narrative that everything that happens in the sex trades is good. It's a job, and it's an industry like many other industries where bad things do happen and they need to be addressed. What our point is that you do not address the bad things that are happening by criminalizing the entire industry. That does not help address the harms that are being perpetuated. We see it as a real hindrance to addressing
Hmm.
those harms. So because we work so closely and also have the expertise on staff around what it is to do sex work and be involved in this, we feel like we have a genuine foundation on what is needed to ensure the safety of people doing sex work. We also we're a law firm, so we have clients who all have either done sex work in the past or experienced trafficking in the sex trades. Some folks who have experienced both, people who have done sex work by choice, and that at other times have experienced trafficking. And we're working on their immigration cases. So right now we just provide immigration legal services, but we're looking to expand those services into other areas because there's a lot of people who do sex work and need legal services, but there is a real lack of legal providers who have that cultural competency to work with sex workers in a trauma-informed, non-oppressive way.
I think so. With the sex workers that do experience trafficking, how do you guys go about helping them?
So We provide legal services. So right now, as I was saying, specifically working on immigration cases. So somebody who's experienced trafficking may be eligible for different types of immigration relief.
Mhm.
There is a T visa, which is a trafficking visa in the United States that is available for people who have experienced trafficking and are from another country. So that is one avenue by which our legal team may assist somebody in getting a T visa. There's also different forms of immigration relief, like seeking asylum. So they may work on an asylum case where the trafficking that somebody experienced is directly linked to why they've been seeking asylum in the United States, that it would be extremely dangerous for them to return to their home country.
Mhm.
Um, and then just other ways that the legal team may be able to make referrals if an individual who has experienced trafficking needs additional assistance. So we have a network of organizations that we would refer individuals to. Perhaps they need assistance with housing, medical care, or mental health services, access to insurance, different forms of support. So since we don't provide social services, we would make a referral to an organization that is trusted and provides culturally competent care to sex workers and people who've experienced trafficking in the sex trades. So that is one tangible way that we assist people who have experienced trafficking. We identify ourselves as an anti-trafficking organization.
Mhm.
We're one of the first oldest national organizations in the US that has both supported sex workers and people who've experienced trafficking in the sex trades.
Yeah, that a lot of people don't think that's even possible, but there you go. It's possible to both support sex work and support those who've been trafficked.
And we see that decriminalization of sex work is the most needed policy change to address trafficking in the sex trades. We see
I
that criminalization is a barrier to people seeking assistance and for sex workers to seek law enforcement assistance if they see someone being abused because they fear criminalization themselves.
I agree completely. So, how many sex workers do you think are trafficked or are victims of trafficking?
So the data is going to be very hard to get because it is a criminalized industry. So it's very hard for people to come forward and say that they are a sex worker. And also because of the stigma around doing sex work, a lot of people don't self-identify as doing sex work. So it's hard to get baseline information about how big the industry is in the
Yeah.
United States and globally. And so if we don't have a baseline understanding of how many people are doing the work, to be able to identify how many people are then trafficked, what the ratio is, what the percentage is impossible. So
Mhm.
anyone who is saying that they have solid data that indicates the percentage of people being trafficked in the sex trades are being disingenuous because we don't have that information. We don't have robust data in that way. There are some organizations who are doing good work to try to do data analysis around the size and scope of the sex trades and the amount of trafficking that's happening in different industries.
Yeah.
Um, but what we do look to is that we have good data to some degree that indicates that trafficking happens in much larger numbers into other labor sectors.
Mhm.
So even data that the United States government agrees is robust and worthy of being reported in their reports, while we may not agree with the absolute numbers that they identify, there is strong indication to show that people are being trafficked in much larger numbers into other industries. That's not to say that trafficking in the sex trade shouldn't be addressed. It's just pointing to the fact that we have a disproportionate focus on trafficking in the sex trades. And that is removing resources and focus on addressing trafficking in other labor sectors. So I'm not answering the specific question of numbers, but that's just because I think that it's a really challenging question to answer and we don't have the good data, but we do have good data that indicates that trafficking happens in great numbers in other industries as well, and that focus needs to be focused in both sex work and in other industries too. For example, in Oregon, in the state of Oregon, there has never been a conviction for trafficking in any other industry other than the sex trades,
Just the sex trade.
even though it's a state that has high numbers of people working in agriculture. There are different industries that we know are dangerous and
Mhm.
have higher rates of trafficking, and to have there never have been a successful investigation or conviction for trafficking in another industry indicates that they are not paying attention sufficiently to industries outside the sex trades.
So do you think you so it's like we as a country pretty much just focus on the sex trade when it comes to trafficking rather than looking at human trafficking as a broader term and going to each individual industry and trying to help the people there.
Yeah, and also trafficking is at one extreme end of labor exploitation.
Mhm.
So it's not that we need to necessarily focus so much more attention on trafficking in other industries, but we need to focus attention on all of the abuses that happen in industries along the way. So
Mhm.
that includes sexual harassment, that includes wage theft, that includes people being forced to work excessive hours that are outside of what should be allowed. We see that in the ways that essential workers, as we've termed it during COVID, are being forced to really risk their lives to work in jobs that are not paying them enough to survive.
Mhm.
All of these things need to be addressed, and trafficking, but trafficking is at an extreme end of labor exploitation.
Yeah,
So we see it as, it's not that we need to shift all of this attention over to trafficking in other industries. It's that we need to address how labor exists in this country broadly and how people are being exploited in restaurants, in fast food restaurants, in domestic work, cleaning in people's homes, people who are working in healthcare settings, people who are in-home nurses. All of these industries, yes, it might not be trafficking, but there is a great number of people experiencing abuses, and those should be addressed too.
I agree. And so this kind of has to do with what we were just talking about. So, and I think a lot of this, like just focusing on the sex trade when it comes to exploitation, comes through stigma. So, what are some of the stigmas that you found about sex work, or what do most people think sex work is when it's really not?
Well, I think kind of what we were speaking to before, that people think that anyone who's doing sex work is being exploited, that
Mhm.
the people who are doing sex work are all cisgender women,
Mhm.
that the people who are customers are all cisgender men. All of these are assumptions that, yes, there are some indications that percentage wise, a lot of women, cis and trans, do sex work, and a lot of clients are cisgender men, but it's not everyone. And when we discuss the sex trades as a monolith, as one group doing the work and one group being the clients, it's not representative of the reality of the work itself.
Mhm.
So I think we need to really complicate our understanding of the sex trades and the people who are doing the work, and recognize that it isn't all people who are being exploited, that this is a job that is giving options for people who have few options. It's also something that some people really see as a calling. They see the work that they do as therapeutic. So really just being more nuanced in our understanding of this work and not assuming it is all one thing or all another.
Mhm.
I think also just considering that it is a job that some people do because they see that they can't survive on minimum wage in this country. So
Mhm.
if you have a problem with somebody doing sex work because they have no other way to make a financial living, you don't have a problem with sex work. You have a problem with the fact that people are forced to live in poverty.
Mhm.
And that's where the focus should be. If people don't have an economic autonomy and freedom to choose their work in any industry, that is a problem. It's not that sex work exists, it's that we don't have safety nets in this country.
I agree. I think that's amazing. And you kind of touched on it, but like you said, one of the like conceptions people have about sex work is that they're all cis white women. And on your page it says stuff about like how these stigmas hurt the LGBTQ community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we see that large numbers of people who do sex work are LGB, a lot of trans and gender non-conforming people do sex work.
Mhm.
And so when we only associate sex work as something done by cis white women, we aren't creating policies or social services that are responsive to the needs of the LGBTQ community.
Mhm.
So we are not creating services that are representative of the life experiences of people who are LGBTQ. And it also creates this stigma and association with the work as being something that it is not. So I think that by not being realistic about who's doing sex work, we're leaving people out, and it makes it more challenging for folks who are doing sex work to seek services. So that's part of what we're seeing is problematic when we're not being honest and realistic about who it is that's at risk of being exploited in the sex trades. That's part of it. And also understanding like the underlying reasons that people are at risk of exploitation potentially. And that's because of historic discrimination that we see in other labor sectors. So the sex trades provides an economic opportunity for people who have experienced disenfranchisement in other labor sectors.
Mhm. And so my whole thing is like educating other people and education of like teens my age so they can like kind of reshape the way they think or what they've been taught their whole lives. Because before I started doing this, I had no idea about any of it. And so that's why I started doing this, just to like educate myself and other people. So with what you do, how important do you think education is?
It's critical. I mean, it is a huge part of what we do. We see that the work that we're doing, it's not about, again, I don't want to glamorize the sex trades. I don't want to make it so people think that there aren't any harms that exist. There are harms that exist. It is not an industry that is necessarily safe. There are so many issues within the sex trades because of the criminalization that exists within it, and because of the stigma that sex workers face, and because there is high rates of violence against sex workers, both by police and clients. And that's because of the stigma that exists within the sex trades. But what is also critical and what we need is we need a culture where people have proper sex education, sexual health education in school at a young age, and have a realistic understanding of the dangers of the sex trades, absolutely, but not in a stigmatizing way, in a realistic way, so that students have an opportunity to like, really question things and find out the truth about a lot of different topics. So we think that education at an appropriate interval for an age group. So we only are supporting decriminalization of adult consensual sex work. So that's for people over 18. We see that children, teenagers, there are so many issues within the sex trades. It is not that we are advocating for youth to be involved in the sex trades. There are laws in place that show that any youth involved in the sex trades, that is trafficking. So I want to be really clear in that decriminalization is really, it's only about adult consensual sex work. But I still think that there needs to be education about trafficking in the sex trades, exploitation that happens, that isn't painting the entire industry as harmful, that is really realistic and honest about sex work and trafficking that may happen in it, and trafficking that could happen in other industries, and also just bring in conversations about labor broadly. I think that students should understand the history of the minimum wage in the United States and why it has been so stagnant for so long, and why people end up in situations where they're feeling economically forced to take a job that they may not want. What creates vulnerability to being exploited in any industry? So it's not just this fear mongering around sex work and being kidnapped and all of this that we see as being hyperbolic, but gives students the opportunity to really understand the history of work and what, being an adult is like. And then also having education around consent and sex and sexual health in a way that is affirming of a wide range of people's experiences with sex and sexuality and gender. I think that would go a long way for us to avoid some of the risk factors for exploitation in the sex trades as well. When people are confident and feel comfortable being able to talk about their sex and sexuality, they're more likely to push back if somebody is trying to abuse them.
Mhm. That was an amazing answer. Thank you. And So for anyone that sees this and wants to learn more, just really quickly, what would you suggest for them to do?
They can go to our website, so swp.urbanjustice.org. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So we've got accounts and we post information regularly. There's also an article. So Freedom Network USA recently put out a position paper on decriminalization, which is an excellent encapsulation of why they've chosen that position and why it's critical for anti-trafficking.
Mhm.
They also put out a blog post that was part of that I can send you a link to that I had written for them.
Great.
And it includes like a resource list. So if people want to do more reading, that's a great place to start.
Perfect. Thank you. And is there anything I missed or anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for the opportunity. And I just hope that students continue to, educate themselves. You don't have to believe everything I said, investigate it. I am one voice of many. So find a diversity of media and information on this subject. It's important that people do rigorous research and rely on real information. There's resources that I would say, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women,
Mhm.
ACLU, Freedom Network USA, the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, Sex Worker Outreach Project. There's a diversity of resources out there. So look for the ones that are, well researched and rigorous.
I will. Thank you so much. That was amazing.